Chapter 5. Ansett walked in the garden by the river. In the songhouse, the garden had been a patch of flowers in the courtyard, or the vegetables in the farmland behind the last chamber. Here, the garden was a vast stretch of grass and shrubs and tall trees that stretched along the two forks of the Susquehanna to where they joined. On the other side of both rivers was a dense, lush forest, and the birds and animals often emerged from the trees to drink or eat from the river. The chamberlain had pleaded with Ansett not to wander in the garden. The space was too large, kilometers in every direction, and the wilderness too dense to do any decent patrolling. But in the 2 years he had lived in McCall's palace, Ansett had tested the limits of his life, and found they were broader than the chamberlain would have liked. There were things Ansett could not do, not because of rules and schedules, but because it would displease McCall, and displeasing McCall was never something Ansett desired. He could not follow McCall into meetings unless he was specially invited. There were times when McCall needed to be alone. Ansett never had to be told. He noticed the mood come over McCall, and left him. There were other things, however, that Ansett had learned he could do. He could enter McCall's private room without asking permission. He discovered, by trial and error, that only a few doors in the palace would not open to his fingers. He had wandered the labyrinth of the palace and knew it better than anyone. It was a way he often amused himself, to stand near a messenger when he was being sent on an errand, and then plan a route that would get him to the destination long before the messengers. It unnerved them, of course, but soon they got into the spirit of the game and raced him, occasionally reaching the end before Ansett. And Ansett could walk in the garden when he wanted to. The chamberlain had argued over it with McCall, but McCall had looked Ansett in the eye and asked, "Does it matter to you to walk in the garden?" "It does, Father McCall." "And you have to walk alone?" "If I can." "Then you will." And that was the end of the argument. Of course, the chamberlain had men watching from a distance, and occasionally a flit passed overhead, but usually Ansett had the feeling of being alone. Except for the animals. It was something he hadn't had that much experience with at the songhouse. Occasional trips to the open country, to the lake, to the desert, but there had not been so many creatures, and there had not been so many songs. The chatter of the squirrels, the cries of geese and jays and crows, the splash of leaping fish. How could men have borne to leave this world? Ansett could not fathom the impulse that would have forced his ancient ancestors into the cold ships and out to planets that, as often as not, killed them. In the peace of birdsong and rushing water, it was impossible to imagine wanting to leave this place, if it was your home. But it was not Ansett's home. Though he loved McCall as he had loved no one but Este, and though he understood the reasons why he had been sent to be McCall's songbird, he nevertheless turned his back on the river and looked at the palace with its dead false stone, and longed to be home again. And as he faced the palace, he heard a sound in the river behind him, and the sound chilled him like a cold wind, and he would have turned to face the danger, except that the gas reached him first, and he fell, and remembered nothing of the kidnapping. Chapter 6. There were no recriminations. The chamberlain didn't dare say, "I told you so," and McCall, though he hid his grief well, was too grieved and worried to bother with blaming anyone except himself. "Find him," he said, and that was all. Said it to the captain of the guard, to the chamberlain, and to the man he called Ferret. "Find him." And they searched. The news spread quickly, of course, that McCall's songbird had been kidnapped, and the people who read and cared at all about the court worried also that the beautiful songbird might have been a victim of the mutilator who still went uncaught in Philadelphia, and Menam, and Hisper. Yet the mutilator's victims were found every day with their bodies torn to pieces, and never was one of the bodies Ansett's. All the ports were closed, and the fleet circled Earth with orders to take any ship that tried to leave the planet and stop any ship that tried to land. Travel between districts and precincts was forbidden on Earth, and thousands of flits and flecks and fleskets were stopped and searched, but there was no sign of Ansett. And while McCall went about his business, there was no hiding the circles under his eyes, and the way he bent a little as he walked, and the fact that the spring was gone from his step. Some thought that Ansett had been stolen for profit, or had been kidnapped by the mutilator, and the body simply had not been found. But those who saw what the kidnapping did to McCall knew that if someone had wanted to weaken McCall, hurt him as deeply as he could be hurt, there would have been no better way than to take the songbird. Chapter 7. The doorknob turned. That would be dinner. Ansett rolled over on the hard bed, his muscles aching. As always, he tried to ignore the burning feeling of guilt in the pit of his stomach. As always, he tried to remember what had happened during the day, for the last heat of the day always gave way to the chill of night soon after he awoke. And, as always, he could neither explain the guilt nor remember the day. It was not Husk with food on a tray. This time it was the man called Master, though Ansett believed that was not his name. Master was always near anger, and fearsomely strong, one of the few men Ansett had met in his life who could make him feel as helpless as the 11-year-old child his body said he was.
"Get up, Songbird."
Ansett slowly stood. They kept him naked in prison, and only his pride kept him from turning away from the harsh eyes that looked him up and down. Only his control kept his cheeks from burning with shame.
"It's a goodbye feast we're having for you, Chirp, and you're going to twitter for us."
Ansett shook his head.
"If you can sing for the bastard McCall, you can sing for honest freemen."
Ansett let his eyes blaze. His voice was on fire as he said, "Be careful of how you speak of him, traitor." Master advanced a step, raising his hand angrily.
"My orders was not to mark you, Chirp, but I can give you pain that doesn't leave a scar if you don't mind how you talk to freeman. Now, you'll sing."
Ansett had never been struck a blow in his life, but it was more the fury in the man's voice than the threat of violence that made Ansett nod. But he still hung back. "Can you please give me my clothing?"
"It ain't cold where we're going," Master said.
"I've never sung like this," Ansett said. "I've never performed without clothing." Master leered.
"What is it then that you do without clothing? McCall's catamite has no secrets we can't see."
Ansett didn't understand the word, but he understood the leer, and he followed Master out the door and down a dark corridor, with his heart even more darkly filled with shame. He wondered why they were having a goodbye feast for him. Was he to be set free? Had McCall paid some unimaginable ransom for him? Or was he to be killed? Ansett thought of McCall, wondered what he was going through. It was not vanity, but recognition of the truth, when Ansett concluded for the 100th time that McCall would be frantic, yet bound by pride in the necessities of government to show nothing at all. Surely McCall would spare no effort hunting for him. Surely McCall would come and take him back. The floor rocked gently as they walked down the wooden corridor. Ansett had long since decided he was imprisoned on a ship, though he had never been on a boat larger than the canoe he had learned to row on the pond near the palace. The amount of real wood used in it would have seemed gaudy and pretentious in a rich man's home. Here, however, it seemed only shabby, peasant rights, and nothing more. Far above he could hear the distant cry of a bird, and a steady singing sound that he imagined to be wind whipping through ropes and cables. He had sung the melody to himself sometimes, and often harmonized to it. And then Master opened the door and with a mocking bow indicated that Ansett should enter first. The boys stopped in the doorframe. Gathered around a long table were 20 or so men, some of whom he had seen before, all of them dressed in one of the strange national costumes of the past-worshipping people of Earth. Ansett couldn't help remembering how McCall mocked such people when they came to a court to present demands or ask for favors. "All these ancient costumes," McCall would say as he lay with Ansett on the floor, staring into the fire. "All these ancient costumes mean nothing. Their ancestors were peasants, most of them. Their ancestors were the wealthy and effete from boring worlds, who came back to Earth hunting for some meaning. They stole the few peasant customs that remained and did shoddy research to discover some more, and thought that they had found the truth, as if shitting in the grass is somehow nobler than doing it into a converter. The great civilizations such people claimed to be heirs to were petty and insignificant to those who had come to think on a galactic scale. But here, where Ansett looked closely into their rough faces and unsmiling eyes, he realized that whatever these people's ancestors might have been, they had acquired the strength of primitiveness, and they reminded him of the vigor of the songhouse, except that their muscles were massive with labor that would have astonished a singer. And Ansett stood before them, soft and white and beautiful and vulnerable, and, despite his control, was afraid. They looked at him with the same curious, knowing, lustful look that Master had given him. Ansett knew that if he allowed the slightest hint of cringing into his manner, they would be encouraged. So he stepped farther into the room, and nothing about his movement showed any sign of the embarrassment and fear that he felt. He seemed unconcerned, his face as blank as if he had never felt any emotion in his life.
"Up on the table!" roared Master behind him, and hands lifted him onto the wood, smeared with spilled wine and rough with crumbs and fragments of food. "Now sing, you little bastard!"
And so he closed his eyes and shaped the ribs around his lungs, and let a low tone pass through his throat. For 2 years he had not sung except at McCall's request. Now he sang for McCall's enemies, and perhaps should have torn at them with his voice, made them cringe before his hatred. But hatred had not been born in Ansett, nor had his life bred it into him, and so he sang something else entirely, sang softly, without words, holding back the tone so that it barely reached their ears.
"Louder!" someone said,
but Ansett ignored him, and soon the jokes and laughter died down as the men strained to hear. The melody was a wandering one, passing through tones and quarter tones easily, gracefully, still low in pitch, but rising and falling rhythmically. Unconsciously, Ansett moved his hands in the strange gestures that had accompanied all his songs since he had opened his heart to Este in the high room. He was never aware of the movements. In fact, he had been puzzled by a notice in a Philadelphia newspaper that he had read in the palace library. To hear McCall's songbird is heavenly, but to watch his hands dance as he sings is nirvana. It was a prudent thing to write in the capital of East America, not 200 kilometers from McCall's palace, but it was the vision of McCall's songbird, held by all those who thought of him at all, and Ansett did not understand, could not picture, what they saw. He only knew what he sang, and now he began to sing words. They were not words of recrimination, but rather the words of his captivity, and the melody became high in the soft upper notes that opened his throat and tightened the muscles at the back of his head and tensed the muscles along the front of his thighs. The notes pierced, and as he slid up and down through haunting third tones, his words spoke of the dark, mysterious guilt he felt in the evenings in his dirty, shabby prison. His words spoke of his longing for Father McCall, though he never spoke his name, not in front of these men, of dreams of the gardens along the Susquehanna River, and of lost, forgotten days that vanished from his memory before he awoke. Most of all, though, he sang of his guilt. At last he became tired, and the song drifted off into a whispered Dorian scale that ended on the wrong note, on a dissonant note that faded into silence, that sounded like part of the song. Finally, Ansett opened his eyes. Even when he sang for an audience he neither liked nor wanted to sing for, he could not help but give them what they wanted. All the men who were not weeping were watching him. None seemed willing to break the mood, until a youngish man down the table said in a thick accent, "Ah, but they were better than Haim and Mithurma." His comment was greeted by sighs and chuckles of agreement, and the looks that met Ansett's eyes were no longer leering and lustful, but rather soft and kind. Ansett had never thought to see such looks in those coarse faces. Chapter 5. Ansett walked in the garden by the river. In the songhouse, the garden had been a patch of flowers in the courtyard, or the vegetables in the farmland behind the last chamber. Be told, he noticed the mood come over McCall, and left him. There were other things, however, that Ansett had learned he could do. He could enter McCall's private room without asking permission. He discovered, by trial and error, that only a few doors in the palace would not open to his fingers. He had wandered the labyrinth of the palace and knew it better than anyone. It was a way he often amused himself, to stand near a messenger when he was being sent on an errand, and then plan a route that would get him to the destination long before the messengers. It unnerved them, of course, but soon they got into the spirit of the game and raced him, occasionally reaching the end before Ansett. And Ansett could walk in the garden when he wanted to. The chamberlain had argued over it with McCall, But McCall had looked Ansett in the eye and asked, "Does it matter to you to walk in the garden?" "It does, Father McCall." "And you have to walk alone?" "Need decent patrolling." But in the 2 years he had lived in McCall's palace, Ansett had tested the limits of his life, and found they were broader than the Chamberlain would have liked. There were things Ansett could not do, not because of rules and schedules, but because it would displease McCall, and displeasing McCall was never something Ansett desired. He could not follow McCall into meetings unless he was specially invited. There were times when McCall needed to be alone. Ansett never had to. Here, the garden was a vast stretch of grass and shrubs and tall trees that stretched along the 2 forks of the Susquehanna to where they joined. On the other side of both rivers was a dense, lush forest, and the birds and animals often emerged from the trees to drink or eat from the river. The Chamberlain had pleaded with Ansett not to wander in the garden. The space was too large, kilometers in every direction, and the wilderness too dense to do anything.